Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all back to the second half of this morning's program, Social Justice and Market Regulation. And my name is James Hanvey. I'm a Jesuit. I'm the Master of Campion Hall in Oxford, and I'm really delighted to be here today to participate in this reflection and debate. As I was listening this morning to Professor Sandel, and also recognizing that I was on the same platform as Gail, who's a French Jesuit, I inevitably thought about Brexit. And first of all, as Professor Sandel had made clear, we experienced not just the surprise of Brexit, but a realization that under the surface there was this extraordinary unheard voice that really wasn't being served by the markets, but nevertheless we still haven't quite understood what to do with that. It's easy to dismiss it as popularism or whatever, but there is, as was brought out this morning, a deep question about justice there. And of course, I think one of the ways in which this idea for this conference emerged was from the encyclical Caritatis in Veritate, by Benedict XVI, in which he introduces the idea of the economy of gift. And I remember at that point when it came out, I was working with our bishops in England and Wales, and we had several meetings with top financiers in the City of London. And the extraordinary thing was none of them understood what the economy of gift was about. They all thought it was about somehow giving to charities and things like that. And it underlines the point that that the economy is also about morality, but very often the economy doesn't know how to think about itself or speak about itself morally. One of the ideas that's been introduced by that encyclical and picked up is this idea of the civil market economy, which is about relationality and mutuality and reciprocity. And I hope that this morning we're going to have an opportunity to explore that idea. It's a very great pleasure, because although Brexit has begun, we haven't quite arrived there yet, to reach out across the English Channel to Gail. Gail is the Chief Economist and Executive Director of Research and Knowledge Directorate of the Agence Française de Développement since January 2015. He specialized in alternative measures of development, general equilibrium theory, and game theory, finance and energy issues. And he's a senior research fellow at the CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research, and at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne Economic Center. He's also the coordinator of the research team called Riskergy on energy resilience and sovereign debt, as well as a member of the scientific committee for the Laboratory of Excellence devoted to financial regulation. He holds the chair of Energy and Prosperity. And so I think for all of these reasons, and many more as we'll discover, I think Gail is really very well suited to introduce this morning's topic to us on social justice. Gail?
So thank you very much for this very kind introduction. It's a privilege for me, Your Excellency, Professor Sandel, to speak here today, especially after your magnificent talk. I want to just tell you a story. I had a PhD student of mine a couple of years ago who was a Chinese girl from mainland China. And once on Monday morning, she came to my office and she told me, "Oh, Prof, I had a beautiful weekend." I said, "Well, what did you do?" She told me, "Well, I spent the whole weekend listening to Michael Sandel." So this is where I realized how deep your influence is, even in mainland China. What I want to do this morning is I will develop my talk in three parts. In the first part, I will ask the question, how come that, what does classical orthodox mainstream economic theory tell us about justice and markets? Just to remind us that the standard wisdom. And as you will see, my conclusion will be those people who believe in the free market ideology, they just know the first chapter of classical textbook. They have never read the second chapter, which they should have done. In the second part, I will try to provide you with an analytical framework where we could discuss how justice and efficiency go hand in hand. And in the third part, I will mention a few thoughts about the common goods, since I believe that these are a huge, building stone of the kind of public deliberation we should have today in pluralist societies. Let me begin with the question, what does the standard theory say? By this I mean, I'm referring to general equilibrium theory, which is the core of neoclassical orthodox economic theory, which was essentially launched just after the Second World War by people like John Kenneth Arrow or Gérard de Breu, a French mathematician, referring, of course, to the neoclassical turn in the late 19th century. What everybody knows is that this theory at this time, during the 50s and the 60s, claimed that if you have a perfectly flexible market, then you have the first welfare theorem, which tells you that every equilibrium will be Pareto efficient, in the sense that if you want to change the distribution of resources, then there will be at least one guy who will be deprived. So there is no way to improve the situation that is the way the market is allocating resources. This was essentially, the main conclusion of this, of the theory of this time. But what was not so clear at this time, unless, even though a number of economists have realized this, is that the sufficient conditions for this were also necessary. What were these conditions? First of all, that there would be no asymmetric information between the people acting together on the market. And as you probably know, Professor Akerlof has made a huge contribution on asymmetric information, understanding how asymmetric information changes entirely the picture. Now, who can claim that there exists at least one market where information would be perfectly symmetric? Nobody, of course. Second condition, that you would have no externality. That is, when I'm consuming something, I don't have any influence on the consumption of anybody else, which of course is obviously wrong, especially given the climate problem we have today. Third, there should be no increasing returns. What does it mean? It means that in the production sector, when you suppose you produce, let's say, 1,000 cars, the last car to produce should be more costly than the first one. And of course, in real life, it's the opposite. Once you have built all the infrastructures in order to build cars, so the first car is very costly because you have a fixed cost to pay upfront, and the last car is, marginally, the marginal cost of the last car is very small. So this describes what we economists, increasing returns to scale, and for the standard celebrating first welfare theorem to hold, you need that returns to scale be decreasing, which is obviously not true in real life. So, and of course, the fourth condition was complete markets, complete financial markets. What does it mean? It means that whatever kind of uncertainty and risk you face, there should be some financial derivative, financial asset, that allows you to insure yourself, to hedge yourself against this risk. To give you an example, at the end of the 20th century, now almost 20 years ago, in Europe, we opened the first market for weather derivatives, where you would be able to buy a bond that would give you some money in case there would not be enough sun in the south of France, which would be detrimental to your industry, let's say, okay, if you are involved in cultivating the Bordeaux wine, okay? This does not exist earlier. So earlier, people involved in this kind of industry, they were facing a risk, weather risk, against which they could not hedge themselves, okay? So complete markets are financial markets where whatever being the kind of risk you face, you will find an instrument on financial markets that will allow you to hedge yourself. Of course, it's obvious that markets are not complete, okay, today. Who can claim that markets are complete? But then, in the 80s, we had a beautiful result by two Greek economists. This is a kind of irony today, given what's happening to Greece. Namely Heraklis Perimarkakis and John Giannakopoulos from Columbia and Yale, who proved that if you have the slightest incompleteness of financial markets, That is, in other words, if there exists the slightest amount of uncertainty against which at least one guy is not able to hedge himself or herself, then the equilibria on the financial markets will be deeply inefficient. They won't even be second best efficient. Okay? This was proven in 1986, exactly at the time where the ideology of free market was, invading everything, all the business schools in the world, including in France. It's very surprising. So, first of all, once you have understood all this, it means that if you just read the first chapter of textbooks, you will believe that markets are efficient. But if you read the second chapter, where you understand that markets are incomplete, that returns to scale are increasing, that there always are asymmetry in information, and then that there are externalities in consumption, then you understand that markets are never efficient. So the true lesson of orthodox, classical, mainstream economics is markets are never efficient. Okay? In addition to that, in 1970, Gérard Debreu, one of the founders of general economic theory, published a paper where he showed that under a number of conditions, you have local uniqueness of equilibria. That is, locally there is a unique equilibrium. So there should not be any debate on which equilibrium we should coordinate on. So at this time, the ideology of free market was based on the conclusion that you have the first welfare theorem, that is, equilibria are always Pareto efficient, and in addition to that, they are locally unique, which means that there is no room for any debate, any deliberation. You know which equilibrium will be chosen by the markets, and it will be efficient. Now, some years later, still in the 80s, people like Andreu Mascolel, who was a famous prof in Harvard, he proved that, again, if you have the slightest incompleteness of financial markets, you have a huge indeterminacy of equilibria. You have a whole continuum of equilibria, which are compatible with the economy you are scrutinizing, which means there is a huge indeterminacy, and there is an issue, which is, on which equilibrium should we coordinate? So, which means, first of all, markets are highly inefficient. They raise a huge question of coordination, on which equilibrium should we coordinate. And the third very important point is that there even are situations where there is no equilibrium at all. This was proven in 2000 by a friend of mine, Takeshi Momi, a Japanese researcher, who provided a robust example where you don't have any equilibrium at all. Existence fails. So what's the use of claiming that we should open the markets to reach efficient equilibria, which are locally unique, when in reality they are inefficient, they are indeterminate, and sometimes they don't even exist. Okay? One way to understand all this is to speak about sunspots. One way to interpret the inefficiency result by Polemarchakis and Giannakopoulos is to see that as soon as you have incomplete markets, they can't be immune against what we call sunspot. What is a sunspot? It's a variation of market prices that has nothing to do with real fundamentals of the economy. Let me just give you an example. In 2002, President Bush went to Japan and had a meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan at this time. As you know, Japan is struggling against deflation since the beginning of the 90s. And when President Bush gave his press conference, he made a lapsus. Instead of saying, oh, it's terrific, it's terrible because Japan is facing a huge deflation, he said, oh, ladies and gentlemen, it's terrible because Japan is facing a huge devaluation. And at this time, I was working as a scientific counselor in private banks. This was before I became Jesuit. And so I can tell you that all people on the markets, they were listening to the press interview of President Bush, and then they realized, oh, Bush is explaining us that there will be a devaluation of the yen. So everybody was selling yen immediately, believing this was true, and then the exchange rate of the yen against the dollar was falling down -1%, -2%, -3% within a couple of hours. So that the Prime Minister of Japan had to make a counter conference saying, no, this was just a lapsus of President Bush. What he wanted to say is that there is a deflation in Japan. And then everybody on the market said, well, we know this since more than 10 years. There is nothing new. Then they bought back the yen, and the yen recovered its exchange rate it had before. So this volatility of the yen had nothing to do with real fundamentals. It was just a sunspot made by someone who said something publicly which was credible for whatever reason and which had an influence on market prices with no real substance. Then what classical theory tells you is that this kind of problem occurs every day on markets, every day. That's why if you try to read and to understand a public sentence by a central banker, you will be at pain because all the central bankers know that all the markets are listening carefully what they say and that they can create a sunspot, exactly in the same way as George Bush in 2002. So that's why this kind of literature, I mean, public speeches of central bankers are just ununderstandable. So that they are sure that nobody will try to, to deduce anything from it, okay? Now, this means that actually, despite what people who have just read the first chapter of textbook believe, there is a room for asking, what about justice today in markets, okay? In addition to that, one last word for this first part, even if it was true that there is no externality, returns to scale are decreasing, etc., etc., so even if the first welfare theorem of the 50s was true, then this would certainly not be the end of the story. Why? Because it's obvious that the Pareto efficiency criterion is not sufficient for justice. This criterion is compatible with the fact that you give everything, all the resources to one guy in the world. Suppose you give everything to Bill Gates. That's Pareto efficient. So obviously it's unfair, okay? And then now if you look at cooperative game theory and social choice theory, you have a number of deepening of concepts that go much farther than the Pareto efficiency concept. You have the core, for those who know that, and you have also the Shapley value by Lloyd Shapley, who passed away now 2 years ago, I guess, a very famous and great American economist. You have also the Arseny value, etc., etc. All these concepts are much deeper than the Pareto efficiency concept, and it turns out that none of these concepts coincides with the variation equilibrium, even if all the conditions for the first welfare theorem are met. Okay? So which means that if we go one step further than the mere Pareto efficiency concept, which is very simplistic, then we don't have any insurance that markets will allocate resources efficiently. One way to understand it is the following, very simple. The Shapley value works as follows. It tells you the value of someone in the economy, in the market, should be measured by how much do we lose if we take away this guy. And one very concrete example to understand is the emergency plans we have in big cities. You know, there are a number of emergency plans. In case, for instance, you would have a huge epidemic in a city. So which people should be, should we take care of in order to ensure the security of people within the city? So the police knows that in case of a big trouble, there are a number of people that they should take care of. These are not the CEOs of the big companies, but these are, so I see how to write it, you say it in English. Yes, the warehouse men who take care of the wastewater collection system. Because if the wastewater collection system breaks down, then that's the end of the whole story in the city. So those people you should take care of are these warehouse men. Now guess how much they are paid in comparison to the CEOs of the big companies. So you see, Shapley value is an alternative way to understand the value of people, which has nothing to do with what faithful people of the free market ideology think. Now, having said that, it means that justice has a word to say even in market economies. On this issue, a couple of Jesuits, including Father David Hellenbach and myself and Matthew Currens, we were engaged 2 years ago in writing a beautiful document, Justice Within a Globalized World, I guess, which was published by Promotio Justitiae, where David has made all the framework, the theological framework for justice. So I won't touch this issue. Please just read what David wrote on this issue. What I want to suggest now, and this is my second part, is that we need a new analytical framework to understand how markets within an economy, within a society could work, given that we can't get rid of the question of justice, okay? And this question, I want to raise it within a context where most macroeconomists, I mean clever macroeconomists, agree on the fact that we have to rewrite entirely macroeconomy. This has been made clear last year by the chief economist, the new chief economist of the World Bank, Paul Romer, who published last year a paper saying, roughly speaking, the last 30 years of macroeconomy have been the theater of a huge intellectual regression. Macroeconomics today is no more a science, it's just a religion where we follow a number of gurus. At the same time, Olivier Blanchard, who was the former chief economist of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, wrote a paper at the same time in summer 2016 saying DSG models, that is the canonical equilibrium model that is used both in IMF, in the World Bank, in the European Central Bank, in the French Central Bank in Paris, etc., are basically flawed, I quote. DSG models are basically flawed. We have to rewrite our models entirely. And the third example is Narayana Kocherlakota, who is less known, but who was the former governor of the Central Bank of Minnesota, who also wrote a paper on his blog saying, essentially, we have to rewrite macroeconomics, and in order to do this, it's not sufficient just to change, some parameters in our models. We have to rewrite the models themselves. So it is in this context that I want to make a number of suggestions. The first one is that we should take seriously private debt and money. Private debt and money have been neglected by most standard macroeconomic models since the last 40 years. And this is certainly a big, big mistake. What is clear today is that we wouldn't have had the huge financial disaster of 2007, 2008 if we had paid attention to the growing amount of private debt before the financial crisis. And by the way, I open a parenthesis, we have the same problem today. I mean, private debt is growing again in a very rapid fashion, at a rapid pace, too rapid. Most probably we'll have a new financial crisis in the coming years. Nobody knows when, I'm not able to tell you when, and nobody can do it, but most probably we are exactly in the same situation as the world was in 2005, 2006. And the same mechanism will probably lead to the same crash. How does it work? It's very easy. And there is one famous American economist who had understood this in the 70s, namely Hyman Minsky. How does it work? You have financial assets whose price increase. So you're an investor and you think, well, I'm stupid not to take advantage of it. So I want to buy these assets in order to make an arbitrage opportunity and to earn money when the price of this asset will increase. For that purpose, I will borrow money. And this is the leverage ratio. And the leverage ratio on the financial American markets, mortgage markets in 2007, were about, the ratio was about approximately 30, which means with $1 you can borrow $30. Multiply it by millions. This gives you an idea of how much money you could put in the markets to buy assets. Now you have done it, and prices of assets are therefore increasing. But there is a moment where a number of these investors have their income coming from the real economy, not from financial markets. And the real economy is not following the huge increase of prices of financial assets. So the gap between the real economy and financial markets lead to a very, very embarrassing situation where you have a number of investors who are not able to pay back their debt, their private debt, because their income do not follow the kind of the debt they contracted in order to buy the assets. So these guys, they will be forced to sell back their assets in order to pay back the debt. But if they do this, then a number of people will sell the assets, the price of the assets will stop growing, and maybe will stagnate at this time. But if it is so, there are a number of other investors who will realize they won't make profit with these assets. So they should rather sell them in order not to have to pay back the debt. Okay? So they will also sell their assets, and then this will be the turning point of the markets, and the price of the assets will fall down. Okay? And this is exactly what we saw in 2007 on financial markets. So this Minsky moment, my guess is that it's going to occur in the coming 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because we are exactly again in the same situation. A huge gap between financial asset prices, the real economy, and a lot of private debt, including in the US. Now, having said this means that private debt and money should play a huge role in the way we try to rethink about macroeconomic. What does it mean in terms of market regulation? It means that we should put into practice counter-cyclical measures. How do we do this? Let me give you a couple of examples. The prudential framework where banks operate, that is, in the IAS, International Accounting Standard norms, under which banks operate, have introduced within the balance sheet of a bank the sunspot I was just describing on markets. How? By the article IAS 39, we allow the value of a financial market, of a financial asset within the balance sheet of a bank, this value, this accounting value, to be just the market value as people on the markets think it is. So if you have a sunspot on market where you have the value of an asset which is very high just because people believe what President Bush says on TV, then this will be reflected on the balance sheet of a bank, which was absolutely impossible 20 years ago. Now it's possible, which means the value of a bank itself may be a sunspot. And this is, of course, a pro-cyclical process. The more you're optimistic on an asset, the more you're optimistic on the bank, etc., etc. So we should do exactly the opposite. So there are a number of proposals to rewrite the international accounting standards and to rewrite also the Basel III framework under which most European banks are working. Same story for insurance companies, which are following the so-called Solvency II framework, which should be rewritten, again, in a way to make it counter-cyclical rather than pro-cyclical. Actually, there was in October 2011 a beautiful declaration by the Pontifical Council of Social and Justice and Peace, on financial regulation, where Father Turkson, at this time, said we should implement a Tobin tax, we should cut the banks, that is, implement, roughly speaking, the Glass-Steagall Act, and we should stop recapitalizing banks with public money without conditions, without the state having an eye on what the banks do with this money. This was, according to me, as far as I know, the first time that the Church had such a precise and concrete statement on financial regulation. The impact, at least in Europe, I don't know about the US, but at least in Europe, the impact was huge. So you would find a number of Catholic finance people very angry against Father Turkson, who would make a pilgrimage to Rome, not just for piety, but also to explain to Father Turkson that he had made a big mistake because he understands nothing about finance, and they would teach him how it works and why we don't need any regulation. Okay? Then at this time, Father Turkson called me to help him resist against these kind of pious Catholic people. But I can tell you the battle was very difficult. And as far as I know, the Council hasn't published anything else on this issue since 2011, which tells you that, we didn't win this battle. Now, on the analytical side, my own work with a friend of mine who is the director of the Fields Institute in Toronto leads to some research based on a beautiful paper by George Akerlof in 1969 on the Lotka-Volterra dynamics, which essentially, roughly speaking, shows the following. Not only isn't it possible to think about efficiency without thinking about justice, but both go together, and reduction of inequality is a condition sine qua non for growth in the long run. Reduction of inequality is a sine qua non condition for growth in the long run. This is what we show in this paper. In other words, the usual dichotomy where people think, well, we should just first let the cake grow and then decide about how to distribute it. In the first part, I told you, even the most classical and orthodox theory would tell you this is wrong. This dichotomy doesn't have any scientific support. And now, in the second part, what I'm telling you is that it's even possible to have an analytical framework where you can show that you need to reduce inequality in the way the cake is distributed in order to foster growth, the size of the cake. Okay? As a side product of this work, what we show is that the famous inequality R bigger than J that has been made famous by Thomas Piketty can be interpreted in the following way. Probably you know that despite what Piketty is claiming, this inequality R bigger than J, which means that the return on capital is bigger than the real growth rate of the economy, of the GDP, let's say. Piketty claims that this shows that capitalists will earn more money than workers. This claim is wrong. And this has been made clear by people like Daron Acemoglu from MIT and a number of other people, Greg Mankiw from Harvard, etc. So, but what we show in our analytical framework is that this inequality does not imply per se that inequality will grow, as Mankiw made clear, but it implies that we may have a collapse in the long run if inequalities today are growing. So, which means that the fact that inequality are growing today might be the symptom or the syndrome of the fact that in the long run we are running into a collapse of the economy. Okay? And the fact that the ratio between capital and GDP is growing makes it even more possible, even more probable. Okay? Now, the Catholic social teaching never accepted this dichotomy between efficiency on the one hand and justice on the other hand. But probably something we could say is that the Catholic magister was at pain in explaining how we could reconcile both, okay, concretely. And the kind of analytical framework I'm just trying to push forward, it seems to me, give us a setup where we can think about it. The role of the state is not just to make sure that private contracts will be enforced. It's also to implement counter-cyclical policy, not just in the way you organize, the accounting framework of banks or of companies, but also in the way you levy taxes, you redistribute, you make public spending in order to reduce inequality, etc. All this contributes to growth. I could tell you the same story for climate change, using the same kind of model that is inspired from the beautiful paper by George, 1969. I have another paper which deals with macroeconomy on the one hand and climate change on the other hand. I was asked to do this by some friends who are working at the IPCC. And as you may know, IPCC is divided into 3 groups. The group 1 is devoted to physics and theoretical physics of climate. The group 2, the impact of this, the probable impact of this on the biosphere and the way we live. Group 3, economics. And I know a number of my friends who are physicists working in group 1 and 2 who just tell you, the economist, everything you are telling us is just bullshit. So you should rewrite your models. Let me give you an example. I mean, we have a number of models that would tell you if we have something like plus 6 degrees centigrade of an increase of the average temperature on Earth at the end of this century, this will just cost us something like minus 10% of the world GDP, which is crazy. We all know, and the climatologists are clear on this issue, if we have plus 6 degrees at the end of this century, then this will be hell on Earth for the huge majority of people living on Earth. Okay? And the bad news is that you probably know that most of the countries belonging to the United Nations have given their intentional nationally determined contributions, INDC, during the COP21 in Paris. This INDC, which is a roadmap for each country describing the way this country believes that it will reduce its emissions of greenhouse gas. This INDC, if you put them all together, you make the bold assumption that everybody will keep its promise. Then, at the end of this century, on average, in expectation, we should reach plus 3 or plus 3.5 degrees, which is far above plus 2 degrees. But this is compatible with a probability of 10% that we reach 6 degrees at the end of this century. So just the indices, if everybody keeps its promise, might lead us to a plus 6 degree increase of the temperature on Earth at the end of this century, which will most probably lead to a huge collapse of the entire human society. I'm sure that if you were to take a plane and then the steward would tell you, oh, by the way, this plane has a 10% chance to fall down during the travel, you would refuse to go in the plane. But the reality is that we are in a big plane, which is the Earth system, which has a 10% chance, if everybody keeps its promise, to have a big crash at the end of this century. So this is essentially what my paper shows, not showing that this is a deterministic story, but that if we do nothing, the business as usual story will be this one. We probably will run into a collapse. So it's urgent to act. And the main mechanism is, again, private debt. Why? Because climate is already destroying capital and GDP, which means the private sector has to invest much more than it would invest without climate change. And most probably you know the figures of Nick Stern, which showed that we need 90 trillions of dollars of investment in green infrastructures in the next 15 years if we want to remain below 2 degrees at the end of the century. 90 trillions, which is, roughly speaking, 1.5 times the world GDP. So that's a lot of money. So the story goes as follows. The private sector will need to invest more and more because of climate change. So the private debt will increase more and more, and there might be a certain point where we will reach a Hyman-Minsky moment. That's essentially the story. But if you don't have private debt in your model, you will never see it. So let me just give you an example. China has written its INDC using a beautiful CGE model, computable general equilibrium model, that has been constructed at MIT with the help of the French Development Agency, of where I'm the chief economist today. In this model, there is no unemployment, no private debt. Then I said to the distinguished professor of Tsinghua University, who was working on this model, Prof, your model is beautiful. The unique problem I have is that if your INDC requires you to have something like, 300% of your GDP in private debt and 80% of unemployment, you will never do it. But you don't know it because the model does not tell this, So, which is another way to explain why we need to change entirely the kind of model we use. And this is an echo of what Michael said just now, 1 hour and a half ago. It seems to me that all this is telling us that we have to discuss about how we want to implement justice in market society, market economies. We have to discuss about which kind of long-run equilibrium we want to reach, how we want to avoid a collapse, etc., etc. One example is the carbon pricing story. You know that the Stern-Stiglitz Commission has been launched last year by the French government and the World Bank, and I am the French representative of the French government in this commission, which will make public its report in 10 days now in the annual assemblies of the World Bank in Washington. In this report, we had huge discussions about carbon pricing, not just markets for carbon, but also carbon taxes, so carbon pricing in a broad sense of the word. And of course, what the report says is that carbon taxes are much more efficient than a big market, okay? Which is just foolish to believe that we will have one day a huge worldwide market where there would be a unique worldwide price that would make everybody happy for carbon, okay? And you may know that there are some French economists who are pushing this idea and who went to the Élysée Palace, where the French president is working, a couple of months before the COP21. And then they came to the cabinet and they said, well, don't worry about COP21, it's useless. What we need is a huge worldwide market where we will have a unique market price for carbon, and this will be the end of the story. Don't waste your time in diplomatic bargaining and these kind of things. Of course, this was criminal because you would have a number of French civil servants at this time who were hesitating. Should we really take time to prepare the COP21, etc., etc.? Is it so important? And then these economists had a very bad influence. Though I was at this time counselor of the French government, and I had to struggle with friends of mine to try to convince the French civil servants that they had to prepare seriously the COP21. Is that the idea that we would have a unique worldwide market for carbon was just a dream, but this is a criminal dream, because as long as we dream about it, we don't implement real regulation in order to go forward. What you see? So, the main point I wanted to stress at the end of this second part, and I will be very brief, I'm too long, is the main point is the following. I mean, the marketing ideology, seems to me, believes that prices are speaking and that they deliver us from the task of talking together, the public deliberation you were just focusing on in your talk. And this, in one of my books, I called the Jacob syndrome. If you remember in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 32, Jacob has to meet his brother, Esau. He's afraid of doing it. He doesn't want to talk to his brother because he believes that his brother might kill him because, he made a number of bad things to his brother, no? Jacob. And then, as you know, he fights against God during the whole night. And then what does he do? He sends, how do you call this? He sends his flocks, exactly, in order, to make his brother peaceful to him. That is, instead of talking to his brother, he sends his flocks, he gives his wealth. And it seems to me, the way some faithful people from the free market ideology think is exactly the same. They are afraid of having to talk to the others, to discuss within a pluralist framework about, divergences, about what we believe to be the common good, let's say. So they rather prefer that markets would give us the signals that help us coordinate without having to talk together. Okay? That's why it was so important in the 50s and 60s to have a first chapter theory that would tell you everything goes well, you have a unique equilibrium which is efficient, so you don't have to talk. Let's just prices speak. And it seems to me the main lesson we have to draw from the last 40 years is that prices don't speak. They are just signals, and these signals might be entirely wrong if they are a sunspot. Remember the story with George Bush. And can we neutralize sunspot? The answer is it's impossible. As long as you have market incompleteness, that is, as long as there will be some tiny uncertainty against which somebody will not be able to hedge himself or herself, you will have sunspot. And therefore, you can't trust market prices. You can't just believe that they are talking on your place. Which means we have to talk together. We have to rethink the way we deliberate among each other. And there is a German theologian, a Jesuit, Father Christoph Theobald, who claims that this is actually a theological, spiritual experience to talk together in a deliberation where we don't agree, okay? Where we try to solve the conflict by talking together. This requires to be able to stay in the shoes of the other without leaving my own place, which is a spiritual experience of hospitality, without denying who I am, what I believe, the value, etc., etc. Okay? And according to Christoph Theobald, one big experience that the Church made in this direction was the Second Council of Vatican, the Second Vatican Council, where you had this huge worldwide arena where people discussed and tried to coordinate on a number of issues on which they deeply disagreed. Okay? So the document of the Council are still ambiguous, and that's why we have this hermeneutic problem today, hermeneutic of continuity, hermeneutic of rupture, etc. But nevertheless, this was a huge experience where people tried to learn to talk together, and this was a spiritual experience. Okay? Essentially, what you do at BBC, it seems, Michael, to me, is going exactly in the same direction. My third point is the following. Having said that the state has a big role to play, a counter-cyclical role within markets that are intrinsically unstable and inefficient, we can't stay there, and I have to say a word about the civil society. It is also one of the main points of the Catholic social teaching that, first of all, the state has a role to play. The Catholic Church never admitted the, let's say, neoliberal point of view, saying that the state should just make sure that private contracts are enforced. Catholic social teaching, starting with Rerum Novarum at the end of the 19th century, also always emphasized the role of the civil society. In order to understand this, it seems to me we have to read the beautiful work by Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize in 2009, she did a beautiful work trying to understand how some populations have succeeded in organizing institutions to take care of commons. What is a common? It's a good that is neither private nor public. A private good is a good where you have rival consumption and you can limit the access to it. When I'm eating a pizza, you can't eat this very pizza, so rival consumption, and in order to be able to eat it, I have to pay a price in order to buy it. Whereas if you go on the sun, because it's delicious, you don't have to pay for it, and it's hard to put a policeman every 10 meters in the campus to prevent you from going on the sun. So the sunlight is a public good. Okay? Now there are a number of goods that are neither private nor public. Let's say, for instance, fishes in the sea. If you just go in the night to fish in a wild way, you will probably break all the traffic relationships between the predators in the sea, and then a couple of weeks later there won't be fish anymore. So privatization of the fishes leads to the destruction of the resource. And this is not just a metaphor, it's exactly what's happening today with fishes in the oceans in the world. You probably know that industrial fisheries today is threatening the reproduction of fishes, and that you have a number of experts who claim that if we go in this direction, if we still follow the business as usual path, then we might not have any eatable fish in the oceans before 2050. Okay? Then this raises a huge question, an interesting question. Do you want to live on Earth where there won't be any fish in the oceans? I have a number of colleagues, economists, who say, well, this is good news, because we will have to make some pisciculture. We say this in English. So fish is in the land, fish farming, yes, and this will increase the GDP. Okay, and this leads to the question: what are the limits of this kind of market thinking? Exactly what you said, Michael. Do we want to live on in a planet where there is no fish in the oceans because this increases the GDP, or do you want to keep these fishes in the ocean even if this might be detrimental to the GDP? Okay. So commons. We are at the French Development Agency. We are studying these kind of resources in order to understand how we could help a number of populations develop by fostering institutions that would take care of these commons. Examples are fisheries, of course, climate, biodiversity, but also you could think of money. Is it right to have a privatized money as we have it in the Eurozone today? And you might think of the Chicago Plan that was conceived in the late 30s by Irving Fisher and the young Milton Friedman, which prevent the banks, the private banks, to create money on their own without the central bank controlling it. Okay? So the Chicago Plan would be a way to make money public, again, whereas in Europe, in the Eurozone today, money is entirely privatized. Okay? The private banks have the right to create money, and they don't have to respond to any democratic control. Okay? All the complementary local currencies that are flourishing everywhere in the world today, especially in the South, Latin America, and in Greece today, are a way for a community to reappropriate the power of money creation and to create a money that is a common. You see? So we might even think of money as being a common in a number of situations. And if you think now on the beautiful work by Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian economist of the 30s, then what Polanyi said is that there are three essential goods which we should never try to commodify or to privatize: the earth, natural resources, money, and labor. And then we could think, how can we organize institutions, political institutions, in such a way that natural resources are common goods, that money is not just privatized and might be also a common money, and that labor is also not commodified. Okay? So this is a beautiful, huge question I'm just raising now. What I want to stress to finish is that the study of commons has led us to a number of questions. First one, how do you change the scale of commons? Most examples of commons are local commons, and there is a big issue: how do you deal with global commons, such as climate. Okay? There is a beautiful example, which is DNDI, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, which is a kind of network where you find both the pharmaceutical industry, private, but also NGOs, states. Everything is based in Switzerland, Geneva, and the purpose is to be able to distribute at a very low price drugs against neglected disease, which are neglected by the standard private sector because you don't have the effective demand for it. Okay, so it's not rentable, especially in Black Africa. So this is an example of a new hybrid institution, which is neither private nor public. It's something else, and it's not a private-public partnership, where you would find a number of actors acting together, which means they have to discuss, in order to protect health. And we know, at least since Ebola, that health is also a common good. You cannot privatize health, because this leads to the kind of tragedies we have seen in Guinea during the Ebola episode. Okay? So this is an example of a worldwide network which works as an institution taking care of common. The question is, how do we build new institutions akin to that in order to deal with the fishes in the ocean, the biodiversity, climate, poverty, etc., etc. For that purpose, it seems to me there are two preconditions, and I will stop here. The first one is that the states have a big role to play in order to ensure that the conditions of possibility of creating new institutions are there. NGOs can't work for free. So if you don't help them, if you don't fund them in a way or another, they won't do the job. So you won't find all these beautiful communities in India, for instance, that gather in order to protect the seeds for women. You won't find all these communities creating new local currencies in order to help fostering the social bind between people, etc., etc. So you need the state not to play the role of the civil society, but to give the framework where the civil society can create new institutions. First precondition. Which means that, according to me, we would have to rethink a political philosophy of the public action, where the state has to implement counter-cyclical policy and to create the conditions so that the civil society can create new institutions in order to take care of the commons. The second precondition is that the civil society itself has enough energy, in a metaphorical sense, to create these institutions. Okay? You will find a number of societies where people are so depressed that they can't do it. Where does this energy come from? And this is the place where I think both the Jewish tradition and Christianity enter the picture. Within the Jewish tradition, you would have a figure like wisdom. You know, in the late books of wisdom, you know, the Proverbs, etc., written after the exile in Babylon, which says something about the way God is providing energy within a society, even a secularized society. Okay? And you would have the Christian translation of it through the concept of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament. As you know, the Holy Spirit in the New Testament is the translation of the figure of Sophia in the late Judaism, the late Greek Judaism. Okay? What does it say? It says that, according to Luke, for instance, that we are receiving a dynamis, which gives us the energy needed to create, to be creative. To be creative for what? For implementing new institutions that will take care of the commons we need. Okay? This is far from being obvious. Of course, saying this, I'm slightly jumping into a theological field. But if you reread, for instance, the dialogue between Karl Marx and Saint-Simon, the French philosopher at the beginning of the 19th century, it was exactly this debate. Marx denied the ability of the civil society to be creative. The unique thing that the proletariat could do is just to destroy the capitalist society through a revolution. While Saint-Simon at this time said, no, we have to be creative. And there is something like the Holy Spirit that gives us the energy for that. And it's not a surprise if you have a number of theologians, including the Father Henri de Lubac, a French Jesuit, who studied Saint-Simon, because actually Saint-Simon is a secularized theology of the Holy Spirit. So this is just to give you a flavor of the fact that this issue, where does the civil society find the energy to create new institutions, is deeply related to the theology of the Bible. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two respondents, and Professor George Akerlof will be well known to you all here. He was the co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economic Science, along with Michael Spence and Joseph Stiglitz. So, Professor Akerlof?
Okay. So, Father Giroux, thank you for a great talk. It was fabulous. So, I feel that he has given a presentation so rich that one hardly knows where to begin. So, he's proposing a total restructure of economics. So, in the first part of his talk, he speaks of the usual concept of optimality in standard economics. Now, all economists know that the equilibria that result from competitive markets fail for a variety of reasons. Most notably, as he mentioned, there are unequal distributions of income, and of course the problems of pollution, and there are many others. But to the best of my knowledge, and this is contrary to the way in which economics is currently written, and actually goes to how Michael was talking about this earlier, there's omission of failures in the most important commons of all. What is that most important commons? That most important commons are the multifarious ways in which we interact in our social lives and also in our business lives. And those interactions develop who we are and what we think. So this is, in fact, the focus also of the third part of Father Giroux's talk. It's about community. It's about community and its importance and how it's fostered. So it's now commonplace to think of the impact of emissions of greenhouse gases on our global commons, and we've heard about that. Now, according to very conservative estimates, sea level rise, these are very conservative estimates, sea level rise alone will result in the displacement of more than 350 million people in the lifetimes of children of some people in this room. There's even the serious possibility of climate change calamity, total calamity, such as can occur in a variety of ways. And so I think probably everybody here knows, for example, about what happens from release of methane from northern tundra, which in turn causes the planet to warm up, which results in more than one-for-one releases in further methane in further warming. And so that, in fact, you can get a total calamity. There are other total calamities. That's just one of the scenarios that people talk about. Now, calamities are extreme cases of the cycles, the Lockwood-Volterra cycles in macroeconomics and in global warming discussed by Father Giroux. But I'm going to talk about another calamity. I think it's another calamity which we're actually implicitly all talking about here, that also takes center stage. This calamity is the increasing constriction of community life. This constriction was publicized some years ago by Robert Putnam, who talked about bowling alone. If we go back 100 years ago, according to sociologist Michael Katz, there was a huge telephone book-sized volume that listed the social and charitable organizations in New York City alone. Such community organizations were a commons. They were a commons that generated a civil society. Following Putnam, this commons, like that of our global atmosphere, is under threat from technical change. In this case, what I think he feels places a great emphasis upon the role of TV, but increasing we'll also see a challenge to it from other electronic sources today. So it's possible, I think maybe I could believe this, that in their infancy, both TV and radio contributed to community, as we all tuned into the same leading stations and channels. But now, we see there's a difference. There's so much choice that everyone just does their own thing, picking what they think they are free to choose. So the media have become separators rather than unifiers. So how far bowling alone has gone? is indicated yet further by a current crisis in the United States, a current crisis in which 11% of prime-age men are out of the labor force. This compares to the number that it was in 1954 when it was 2%. This 11%, I should add, that's in addition to the standard statistic of the more than 4% of prime-age men who are unemployed. So why are the NILFs, the not in the labor force men, what are they doing? Okay? So we have time use surveys. We have time use surveys which show that they're spending 335 minutes a day watching TV. 80% of them are unmarried. The NILFs are not taking care of children as they might be. They spend the same amount of time as the working men on average, which is on average less than a half an hour a day. Nor is much of their time spent on education. Some of them are doing education. On average, that's only 25 minutes per day. So the need for Father Giraud's new economics can be seen in a recent National Bureau of Economic Research working paper. Now, that working paper attributes the increase in NILFs to the lower price of enjoying leisure because the new electronics is so cheap and because the foregoing wages from not working are so low. There's, in fact, a much bleaker vision of the prime-age NILFs. So Ann Case and Angus Deaton, they've focused our attention on their escalating depression, their alcoholism, their suicide, and their drug addiction. So out of the labor force, unmarried, watching TV 335 minutes a day, compulsively playing video games, and at high risk of suicide, depression, alcoholism, and heroin addiction, that's the antithesis of belonging to a community. So I interpret these statistics as symptoms of the failures of the interacting commons of the communities to which we all belong and to which we should all belong. These commons include our families, our schools, our churches, our political groups, our friendship groups, our workplaces, and our bowling groups. There's another example which shows the role of community in promoting well-being and values. So back in the 1990s, I think this has mainly disappeared now, a group of education scholars influenced greatly by James Coleman coined the phrase shopping mall high to characterize U.S. Education. So U.S. high schools were not compared to shopping malls because of their architecture, although that may be accurate in California. Instead, they were shopping mall highs because of the prevalent view regarding what the schools were supposed to do. The idea was that the role of schools was to give the students what they wanted. That's at the shopping mall, you were treated as a customer. And thus, at Shopping Mall High, you can take advanced placement courses if that's what you want. But so too, if you only want to be entertained, the schools will give you that too. So there was a treaty, that's how it was described. There was a treaty between the school and the students that the school will not try to change who they think they are. But that said this reform movement was exactly what schools should be doing. That should be schools' mission. So leading evidence in favor of such reform was given by studies of Catholic schools. So there's an important book by Anthony Brick which stressed the role of community in the Catholic schools. So Brick and his co-authors describe in detail how Catholic schools establish such a school community in which students accept the school's goals and ideals. All the teachers assume responsibility. They assume responsibility for shaping student character, and they are supposed to be involved in many aspects of students' lives. So lack of specializations makes this feasible, as, for example, the English teacher of the morning is likely to be the counselor at lunchtime and possibly the soccer coach of the afternoon. So Brick has many measures that contrast the greater feeling of community in the Catholic schools in comparison to the public schools, and says that that is one of the reasons why the Catholic schools have been so much more successful than the public schools. Okay, so this then takes us back to Father Giraud's talk and his emphasis on the role of community and the penumbra of communities we have a part of our lives. This should be, and it ought to be, the very center of our ideas regarding economics and what it means to live in a just society. So consider that more than 11% of the US male population in their prime working years do not have the most elementary connections to even be searching for a job. Consider also that correspondingly, there are women and children who are going to suffer with them. So this failure of community is much a failure of the commons as the disappearing glaciers of Antarctica. And our failure to deal with this imminent and worsening problem as to deal with our problems of macroeconomic stability comes out of the disappearance of commons outside the workplace, which tells us who we are and who we ought to be. So it fails to see that we should not view our institutions as shopping mall highs in which we just take what we want and we just go to them for what we're going to get out of them. What we should get out of them most of all is we should get the appropriate values. For people to fulfill the lives they want, our institutions must also be communities. Communities in which we learn how to be better people, in which we learn to be better people aiming for the common good. So I think we've been talking about a lot of failures of the commons, but this is also a further failure of the commons. I think it's the failure of the commons that economics especially fails to see. So, thank you.
Thank you. And the next respondent is Erin Loves, Associate Professor of Theology at the College of St. Elizabeth, Morristown, New Jersey. And Erin's field is field of energy ethics, and she's a scholar-based environmental movement.
Well, thank you. It's an extraordinary privilege to be here today in such a distinguished company with Your Excellency. Following your discussion, Professor Sandel, inviting us to reconsider sacred goods amidst market thinking and a renewed public discourse, to hear Professor Giraud's extraordinary scholarship in analyzing the macroeconomics of the collapse that we may see, and following Professor Akerlof's discussion of the critical need for community that is so at risk. This discussion of the apocalypse we may face in this age of the Anthropocene invites us to see how, in his paper, Coping with Collapse, the model of labor productivity, the damages of global warming, various climate sensitivities, and intersecting carbon price paths allow us to anticipate a possible breakdown of planetary economic collapse, this is a quote, either shortly before or around the next century's turning point. So this reminds me of Virginia Woolf. On or about December 1910, human character change. It's perhaps good to know when the collapse will come if we continue on this trajectory, unless we are lucky enough to have a 1.5 climate sensitivity. We need it to shift to zero net emissions by 2075 and see a rapid increase in the carbon price. So this speaks to the economic collapse that will certainly accompany a global environmental collapse, and I will focus on the environmental themes here. So both the prudent and the desperate will ask, how can we avert this judgment of a history we hope is not written? And the answer may depend upon the capacity for human character to change again. Father Giraud concludes that paper with calls for strong and immediate action to escape what Fernand Braudel called being the prisoner of climate, recognizing in his time the great power of nature. But today, the tables have turned. In light of the destruction wrought by humanity's rise to power, from biological agent to geological force, historian Dinesh Chakrabarty asks if the Anthropocene presents a new and shocking ecological limit to freedom. In the light of faith, however, freedom has always been read as having moral and material limits. Karl Rahner writes, "The freedom of finite creatures is offered by the Creator God and must be shaped creatively in a life-giving way." So it is not freedom's limits that are novel, but the context for freedom's exercise, which is the novel and tragic signs of the time of the Anthropocene and the ecological crisis. So this crisis requires humanity to recognize technology's real consequences, accept the limits of our choices, and accelerate progress rapidly to a new global energy system. How do we accomplish this? We have the technology. Arguably, we have had it for a long time, referring to the classic 2004 article by Pakala on Sakalo on available energy sources. Buttressed by current analyses of the availability of wind, water, and solar to meet all global energy needs by Jacobson et al. Of Stanford. Increasingly today, that technology is cost effective. We have robust magisterial teaching summoning us to care for our common home, and rich theories of justice in Catholic social teaching. We have a profound theological anthropology that is committed to the common good and willing to bear differentiated burdens in the enactment of distributive and contributive justice as a task of sacrificial discipleship. Furthermore, we have compelling Catholic visions of the market. For example, Christine Fearer-Hinsey writes that Catholic social teaching commits one to a radically inclusive, provisioning understanding of the economy's purpose, situated within an integral ecology. And she writes, this wider view of the provisioning purpose of the economy challenges a market orthodoxy in which, quote, modern capitalism revolves around an economistic axis. This economistic axis legitimately defends and seeks economic welfare, but excessively correlates quality of life with wealth. So instead, Hinsey discusses proposals for an axial reorientation toward a well-being and development axis that includes life satisfaction and overall well-being, as well as economic well-being and sustainability. And there are many measures to serve this revisioned economy, reoriented to a well-being axis. These include, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, the American Well-Being Index, but also the World Happiness Report, and new economic theories like prosperity without growth. So with all these resources, it seems like a recipe for success. But this success is clearly not evident. We are not rapidly transitioning to a renewable economy, even though market aims for efficiency and cost parity alone are driving this transition in many places. Nor would a theoretical axial reorientation to well-being and the common good guarantee this transition, because there are powerful forces obstructing the renewal of our energy structures in the present economy, whether its economistic axis is accepted or critiqued. Indeed, the evidence that intentional actors are obstructing the natural transition to renewables reveals an oligarchic axis. Pope Francis intensifies this critique. He observes that the reigning market logic is not merely economistic, but exclusionary, to the point of death. We have to say, thou shalt not, to an economy that kills, to ecological destruction that kills. We know the ways in which environmental injustice falls heaviest upon the poor, through environmental racism, unequal capacity to recover from disaster, energy poverty, the ecological debt overusing the climate sink, current toxic pollution in the present and future guaranteed increase of social strife and climate refugees. Physicians for Social Responsibility note that every year 500,000 children are born in the United States with blood mercury levels high enough to impair their performance on neurodevelopmental tests and cause lifelong loss of intelligence. So this devastating harm exposes what has been called a political economy of private profits and socialized risks. This is radically counter to what Justice in the Global Economy calls a biblical, moral, and religious vision that can help us shape global economic life to protect the integrity of the environment and the well-being of all humans. So we see prisoners in a cage of impaired intelligence. In the wider cultural sense, as Professor Sandel observes, prisoners of the shift from a market economy to a market society as market values crowd out non-market norms. Prisoners of ugliness in the loss of the natural world, and still prisoners of climate, not the victims of nature, but of ourselves. We have seen the enemy, and he is us, and of intentional agents who obstruct change. Justice in the global economy, again, affirms this oligarchic exclusion, recognizing that those with substantial wealth have advantages in accessing and influencing the political system. How does this obstruction occur? I will look at two ways, through attacks on transparency and subsidiarity. And how then do we counter denial and, to borrow a phrase from Professor Hollenbach, adjudicate these claims in conflict? An example of transparency with which you're all familiar, the Exxon New investigation. The award-winning investigation of the ways that Exxon was aware of climate change and climate damages due to the burning of fossil fuels as early as 1977, yet this information was suppressed. Exxon spent decades refusing to publicly acknowledge climate change and even promoted misinformation, conscious that their products would not stay profitable once the world understood the risks. Indeed, a former Securities and Exchange Commissioner now argues that we are facing a new redefinition of fiduciary responsibility, in which investments in fossil fuels are unacceptably risky, precisely due to the risks of stranded assets and the moral responsibility to avert climate change. Thus, corporate responsibility professionals reenact what Daniel Finn calls the moral ecology of markets by engaging a spectrum of investment strategies, and the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative is one example of such professionals. It's notable that on February 23, Exxon wrote off billions of dollars of assets in tar sands, a move watched closely by investors and those observing the bottom line and moral integrity. So we wonder if we must say, "Thou shalt not," to a wealth portfolio that kills. These assets are truly subject to a social mortgage. And pragmatically, recall the 90 trillion that Father Giraud states is necessary to build the renewable economy. These assets are needed. For an example of an obstruction of subsidiarity, the well-known case of Denton, Texas, which voted to ban fracking in its municipality. It was then sued by the Texas Oil and Gas Association and the Land Office on the grounds that the rights of families and mineral owners were being denied access to their property, which is protected under the US Constitution. The Texas legislature rendered the town's ban moot by passing a bill which preempted all local legislation, all local regulation of below-ground oil activities. So this is against consent. Fracking resumed in Denton in June 2015, on or about the time of the promulgation of Laudato Si. So when the ownership and claims to mineral rights trump human rights, environmental protection, and municipal self-determination, how do we strengthen those human rights? How do we bend the economistic and oligarchic axis toward the arc of justice? Catholic rights theory recognizes that distributive justice may constrain contract and property rights, but checks upon these individual rights are extraordinarily countercultural against what Professor Sandel expresses as the power and prestige of market thinking. And after Laudato Si, if Catholic social teaching is no longer the best kept secret it has been for so long, it seems only to attract ever more pointed attacks. So how do we not merely recognize and teach distributive justice, but enable these principles to have a real voice in the culture? What is the potential of Catholic institutions to raise these issues in the culture, to educate its students and future professionals? When you think of, in a sense, the banality of legal assignments, such as continuing the Denton case, this work, expanding and increasing access to fracked gas, it remains within the vocabulary of providing, resourcing, supplying unless a radical interruption to this language game unmasks it as the exploitation, poisoning, earth-shaking, ice melting, children poisoning, and future desiccation that it really is. This interruption only comes from a powerful moral signal. How can Catholic institutions interrupt the complicity, change the language, shift the culture, and send this moral signal? How can it lift the cross off future generations facing crucified climate, crucified nature, like a Simon of Cyrene? And how can it enable this message to be fruitful in dialogue, in the public square, in a diverse civil society, appealing to our shared and common values? There are many ways that Catholic scholarship and teaching can explicate the tasks of contributive justice on all levels, especially to lift up the obligations to support workers in transitional economies in the fossil fuel industry. I will conclude with some recommendations or discussion of these drawing from Justice in the Global Economy, that certainly we can strengthen measures of the common good as a corrective to GDP. We can surface the ways that subsidies for fossil fuels function that are insufficiently transparent. And there are multiple roles for multiple actors here, for consumers, CEOs, investors, mayors, utility leaders, pastors. Thirdly, the role of a carbon price, the carbon fee, needs to be better explicated and better understood. And here we must draw on the best in climate communication theory and marketing to make this valuable concept more understandable to the American public that is allergic to any references to something framed as a tax. How do we emphasize the interdependence of this social cost, these externalities borne by the vulnerable? There's also a valuable stream of thought in Laudato Si, also explicated in the Vatican's text, Energy, Justice, and Peace, that stresses the obligation of developed nations to particularly serve the transition to renewable energy, to take upon themselves that transition because of their greater resources, to share that technology with developing nations, and allow developing nations the immediate access to more available fossil fuels to support their own development. This is an important line of research. And we need to find ways to communicate and evangelize our connections, not our competition. As Father Giraud said, how can we expand our capacity to speak with our brothers and sisters? In my research with faith-based environmentalists, I have found that the strongest motivation among them is a deep intuition of the unity of the human family and the interconnection of their actions and impacts. In many ways, we have lost a sense of the commons, of the common duties, the munia that we share and that ground our rights. These duties and needs are, in Professor Hyde's words, common as air indeed. It is most common to all creatures. We all breathe this common air. And if we can act on this truth, we may not only cope with the collapse, but may avoid it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very conscious that we're about to be overtaken by nature in the call to lunch. But Gail just would like to have some brief responses to...
Yeah, thank you very briefly. Thank you for both comments. It was very, very inspiring for me. What I would say is that it seems to me clear, and you know this better than I do, that white poor people in the US are those who suffered in the way you just described, and also are those who voted for Trump. So there is a strong relationship between the two phenomena. And also on the beautiful way you described communities and the way, I mean, they should be emphasized today. What I would say also, it seems to me, this does not mean we should walk in the direction of a communitarian philosophy, political philosophy. My viewpoint is that there are a number of communities that should be created just for a resource. I mean, I don't know what is the essence of a community today, but we could think of creating new communities, and here we are creating a new community just right now because we are talking together, that would take care of a number of resources they have in common. So it's not as if we would say, let's look at the communities that already exist and formalize them, etc., which would be probably a communitarian viewpoint. But if we want to take care of a number of resources, be they natural, intellectual, cultural, etc., then we have to build communities. And then just also a last word on this. With a friend of mine who Father Hollenbach know, Sister Cécile Renoir, we built a new index at the French Development Agency which tries to measure the quality of the social relationships we have within a community, the Relational Capability Index. We have applied it in the south of Nigeria, in a place where you may know that it's almost a civil war. If a white guy walks on the street, he will be, after a few minutes, kidnapped, and then his society will have to pay a lot of money for that. So we went there, Cécile and myself, so I had to wear my Roman collar every day just to show, my value is nothing. So don't kidnap me, because you won't earn money with me. And so we succeeded in surviving 3 weeks this way. But even after 3 weeks, our students, Nigerian students, would tell us, just disappear because the bad boys came to kidnap you. But the conclusion we drew from this survey is that the way a company like Total, a French oil company, has distributed money to buy the civil peace has actually destroyed the social network within the villages. Because you would have one guy who would receive a huge amount of money, even though this money for Total is nothing. But for him, living in the village, in the savannah, it was a huge amount of money. This guy would immediately leave his village, go to the capital, Lagos. He has a wife and children in the village, but he doesn't care. So once in a month, he would come back to the village to kiss his wife, and that's it. So the family is destroyed, the village is destroyed. He goes to the city, to Lagos, with a new life, a new wife, a new family. Okay? And of course, this destroys entirely the ties within the village. And at the end of the day, this destroys the entire society. So huge inequalities in income can just destroy also everything we have in common. So this guy, at the end of the day, had nothing else in common with his best friends, his wife, and all the society he was born in. Okay, and to what you said, thanks a lot. What I wanted to add is, first of all, human rights. I totally agree that human rights should be conceived as one of the limits of, commodification and market thinking. Surprisingly enough, you don't see anything about human rights in the Sustainable Development Goals. So the United Nations gathered in September 2015 in New York, converged to 17 sustainable SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which are supposed to summarize everything we want to have in order to have, both in the north and in the south, a sustainable development. And there is nothing about democracy, nothing about human rights, as if we would believe it's possible to have sustainable development without mentioning human rights. And one consequence of that is that right now at the French Development Agency, which is the French analog of USAID, we are writing the strategic roadmap of the bank. And we have a discussion which is just astonishing, where a number of colleagues of mine are saying, why should we mention human rights? We all know that it's impossible to put them into practice. The SDGs don't mention them. Probably it means they are not that important, you see, which is a very terrific perspective, it seems to me. And what I also wanted to say is that you are perfectly right in emphasizing the fact that if we want to keep the increase of the temperature below 2 degrees, we need to have a zero net emission somewhere in the second half of this century, and probably before 2075. Everybody, all the experts agree on this. But this is not the end of the debate, because in this formulation there is a small word, net emissions, which means some people dream that we would have gross emissions still growing, and that we would develop capture and storage technologies to keep carbon, let's say in the soil, for instance, that would allow us to have net zero emission and growing gross emissions. Of course, this is probably irresponsible and foolish, because we don't know today whether we will be able to store all this huge amount of carbon in the soil without destroying Earth. Nobody knows, okay? We know it's possible to do it at a certain level, but can we reach the right scale for that? And so this reminds me that there is a huge debate on the role of technology. You still find a number of people who believe, who dream that technology will save us. You also mentioned this, Michael, this morning, and that we don't have to make any efforts. For instance, I met a good friend of mine who is prof at MIT, who has perfectly understood everything we say this morning, but who told me, yes, you know, Gail, we don't have to make a lot of efforts. We at MIT, we are so clever that we will find some bacteria that will digest carbon, and then we won't have to bother about climate. So this seems to be irresponsible and foolish.
Well, speaking of digestive, so here we are, and we're about to move to lunch. I'm very sorry that we haven't had time for questions, but I think you'll agree with me that the quality and the richness of what we've received this morning will continue right the way into the discussion this afternoon. So I want to thank all our contributors this morning for the very stimulating input. Thank you.